Do you like clean water? Do you like your house not being flooded? Do you like observing aquatic flora and fauna in nature? If you're like me, you'll probably say yes to these questions, which leads me to ask you, have you heard of this thing called a wetland? Of course you haven't. That's why you clicked on this video. Well, you came to the right place. So in this video, I'm going to explain what wetlands are, why they are beneficial to us, and what we can do to protect them. Simply put, wetlands are areas of land that are saturated with water, either permanently, long periods of time, or short periods of time. But at the very base of it is that they are saturated with water, either on the surface or in the surface, but they contain water. Now, wetlands come in all different types of shapes and sizes. They're found on all 6 continents except Antarctica, and they can be classified by 2 general categories. Ones that are by the sea are tidal or coastal wetlands. Now, ones that are in landlocked areas or not by a large body of water are known as inland or non-tidal wetlands. Given that I live in Indiana, I'm going to stick with the category of non-tidal or inland wetlands because I'm most familiar with that. But much of the information goes hand in hand across the 2 categories. Now, inland wetlands are often found along floodplains near streams or rivers, but they can be within areas that are largely isolated from water. So to start with, the first category that is used to classify a wetland is depressional topography, basically meaning that the overall topography of the environment around it is in a kind of decline, depressional pool, if you will. And this is important because this allows water when it rains or snows and that snow melts for it to flow into the kind of depressional area and water collects up. Now, the second thing that's important for a wetland to contain is hydric soil, or basically water saturated soil. So basically the soil within a wetland is almost completely full of water. And so this creates a anaerobic environment, or essentially an environment without much oxygen, because this allows for microbes and other bacteria to get in and start respiring and kind of using up all the oxygen that is left and kind of giving off the carbon dioxide. And lastly, the third category needed is that the wetland must have this thing called hydrophytic vegetation, meaning that vegetation that can live in the anaerobic hydric soil that I just described and be able to not only live in it but flourish in it. And so basically, this is vegetation that loves to be in soil that's saturated with water and can live in flooded areas, which is what a wetland is. And so, furthermore, with this soil, the soil has very poor drainage, meaning that if the water wants to seep through, it goes through very, very slowly. So, water exits out of the wetland very, very slowly, meaning that most of it's going to stay pooled up at the surface or within the soil. And lastly, in terms of back to inland or non-tidal wetlands, there's 3 subcategories within this category in terms of time duration that water is within a wetland. So the first one is perennial wetland, meaning that the wetland is flooded all year long. The water levels can fluctuate up and down, but most of the time, if not basically all the time, unless it's a very extreme drought or other circumstance, the wetland's completely flooded with water. The second one is intermittent wetland, meaning that the wetland is flooded during, you could say, most periods of the year or good amounts of the year with water, but during certain seasons like the fall or summer, sometimes there can be no water at all. And so it kind of fluctuates between having water and not having water. And lastly, an ephemeral wetland is essentially a wetland that is formed due to a very high precipitation event, like a very rain intensive storm, which will form a wetland that can stay around for a few days before it eventually dries up. So just to summarize this part of the video, in case you forgot everything I said, simply put, wetlands are areas of land that are saturated with water at or near the surface. Now for the second part of the video, how wetlands are beneficial to us. So wetlands are actually one of the most productive ecosystems in the world. They provide a variety of microbes, plants, mammals, birds, all sorts of animals and insects and vegetation of all kinds with shelter, food, water, and a variety of other services. For example, within Louisiana, there are a lot of shellfish and fish caught around the state that are wetland dependent species, meaning if the wetlands disappear, those species disappear, meaning that the fishermen that depend on these species to make a living are no longer going to be able to make a living if the wetlands disappear. And wetlands are not only important for us getting our food, but they're also very important for flood protection. So essentially, wetlands act as sponges, essentially, during high precipitation events, like during rain intensive storms. And because when there's a lot of water moving around on the surface from as a result of the precipitation, the wetlands will essentially take up this water that comes into its area and hold on to it, and then eventually slowly release it back out once it gets too full, compared to like a river, for example, which quickly accumulates up water during a storm and then just releases it in the surrounding area. And lastly, wetlands are very important for filtering out natural and man-made pollutants. So in terms of a man-made example, when wetlands are situated near farms, these farms are going to typically use pesticides and fertilizers to help their crops grow and be as productive as possible. But the consequence of that is that eventually these chemicals that have been put on these crops are not going to be taken up completely by the crops and all the other plants. And essentially, it's going to either leach from the soil into a surrounding body of water or run off from the top of the soil into a surrounding body of water. But wetlands kind of act as a filter in terms of intercepting these pollutants and basically being able to filter them out using the hydrophytic vegetation that essentially takes up these chemicals, stores them for a bit, while the water will then eventually pass through in a much cleaner form. And so this kind of harkens back to what I was saying about wetlands being beneficial for species and help providing us food, because when you have cleaner water as a result of nearby wetlands, if you're looking at like a stream and it's a lot cleaner due to the wetlands nearby, this is also going to help the aquatic flora and fauna within that stream, because the water at least has a larger reduced concentration of chemicals, meaning that the aquatic flora and fauna are more likely to survive and reproduce. So, just to recap this section, wetlands are important for flood protection, filtering out man made and natural pollutants for cleaner water, and finally, they also provide a biodiverse and very productive ecosystem that benefits nature and ourselves. So, for the last section, in terms of what we can do to protect wetlands, I want to talk about a bit of context. So, within the US and my home state of Indiana, there have been a lot of rolling back of regulations and protections for wetlands. Now, this is, of course, beneficial to real estate developers and big agricultural companies who are looking to develop homes and apartments or develop new crop fields and all of that. But it's detrimental to all of us because it affects our ability to obtain clean water, as well as enjoy the nature around us, as well as be able to obtain food and all the other benefits that I've listed before. But just like a lot of environmental problems, there's a lot we can do to turn this around. And when researching some solutions that I could do to help protect wetlands and all of that, I must admit, when I was Googling it, oftentimes many of the recommendations were what I could do personally to help wetlands, like pick up trash, make sure I don't go off the trail and impede on natural environment, all that stuff. And while that stuff is still very important, chances are you're probably not going to be responsible for the destruction of thousands of acres of wetlands, because as an individual, you're not a multinational ag company or real estate developer. And so ultimately, what I wanted to focus on in terms of this section was what I can do in terms of politically or movement wise for wetlands. And while this video is sort of in the context of US politics, chances are if you live in a democracy, these solutions that I'm going to give you are probably going to work as well in whatever country that you're in. So the first thing that you can do is vote for politicians who care about putting the environment over profit. And in terms of those who don't have any elections coming up, if there is a politician that you would like to start putting the environment over profit, feel free to contact them with letters, emails, call them, whatever you can to try to convince them to take on that stance. Now, the second thing you can do is become an activist for wetlands. This can mean organizing protests or setting up social media pages that advocate for wetlands, anything you can do to show your support for wetlands. Now, the third thing that you can do is donate or volunteer for nonprofits that care about protecting and preserving wetlands as much as you do. And so, for my Hoosiers out there, there is a nonprofit called the Hoosier Environmental Council, linked down in bio, that advocates for wetlands within Indiana. But essentially, in terms of nonprofits, check out their pages, do what you can to help them, because that's basically their job is to help wetlands and to keep them around in the area that you're in. And my fourth and last point is to talk with friends, family, acquaintances, whoever you can about wetlands and kind of spreading the information that I've told you onto them. Now, if you don't really know how to kind of advocate for the protection of wetlands or just advocate for an environmental topic that you're passionate about, be sure to check out my video a few months ago called How to Talk, Debate, and Discuss for Sustainability. And that will give you a few techniques on how to hopefully convince or at least open the mind of someone who's a bit more stubborn on environmental issues. And as a result, these solutions should hopefully get you started in not only maybe creating a local or regional movement within your area, but also helping to push the not only national but global movement to help and preserve and protect these amazing ecosystems. So for the summary of this video, I wanted to come to a wetland that was near my house. I believe the wetland is an intermittent wetland because it's not currently saturated with a lot of water right now. The soil is of course saturated, but the news about this wetland is that there was a developer who was developing an apartment complex in some suburbs around the surrounding area, which you can see, which I can see, but you can't. But they were unable to build on this land because it was a wetland, and the regulations that were around during the time were protecting it, which of course is a very nice thing because it's quite a scenic wetland to look at. So to summarize this video, wetlands are formed within areas that have depressional topography, contain hydrophytic vegetation, and have hydric soils. Now, they also benefit humans by fostering biodiverse ecosystems that can help with our fishing or hunting. They also help filter out natural and man-made pollutants, as well as create flood protection for everybody. Now, within the US and around the world, wetlands are under threat. So if you care about wetlands or just the natural environment, you should focus on not only doing what you can physically, like for example, picking up any trash that you see, but also focusing on what you can do politically. And in return, you will be joining a movement that will not only aid in the conservation, the preservation of wetlands across the world, but the natural environment as well. And in return, you will not only be keeping the natural environment and its wetlands pretty and pristine for the current generations, as well as help it do its job to benefit nature and us as well, but this will also carry on to future generations, and that's what matters.